The day my mother remarried, I wasn't sure how I felt. For years, it had been just the two of us against the world, navigating life's messes and patching up our little family with inside jokes and late-night talks. Then, she met Tom, a soft-spoken man who somehow made her laugh in a way I hadn't seen before. I wanted her to be happy. She deserved that much after everything. But there was a catch. Tom came with a son, Alex. Alex and I had barely spoken more than a few words the first few times our families merged at dinners or gatherings. He was quieter than I expected, often lost in his thoughts, hovering on the periphery of our new blended family with an unreadable expression. When I tried to make small talk, he would respond politely but never really opened up. There was a distance to him, an air of mystery that intrigued me even though I knew I probably shouldn't care. A few months passed, and despite living in the same house now, we still didn't know each other well. My mother was thrilled with our new family arrangement, planning movie nights and trying to make it feel like we were truly one big family. But I sensed something different, a tension, something unspoken, simmering between Alex and me. We weren't friends, but we weren't exactly strangers either. And over time, I found myself looking for him in small moments, wondering what he thought about, or if he even noticed me the way I noticed him. It was a Saturday morning when I first felt the weight of that strange attraction. My mom and Tom had planned a day out with friends, leaving Alex and me alone in the house. I was up early, working through a list of chores I hadn't planned on but figured would keep me busy. I was in the kitchen, wiping down counters, and every now and then, I'd catch myself glancing at the doorway, half expecting him to appear. The house was unusually quiet, every creak and rustle amplified by the emptiness. Just as I was lost in my thoughts, I heard his footsteps coming down the stairs, slow and deliberate. When he appeared in the doorway, his gaze lingered on me, for a moment too long. And I felt a spark, a fleeting jolt of something I couldn't quite name. I brushed it off as I smiled, hoping to keep things casual. "Hey, sleepyhead," I teased, trying to sound lighthearted. He smirked, leaning against the doorway with a casualness that seemed almost rehearsed. "Morning. Getting an early start on the chores, I see." I rolled my eyes. Someone has to keep this place clean. He watched me, his eyes darker than I remembered, and I felt a strange warmth creeping up my neck. I turned back to the counter, feeling his gaze settle over me like a weight I couldn't shake. "You want any help?" he asked, after a moment, though his tone made me think he was only half serious. I shrugged, forcing a smile. "Only if you don't mind getting your hands dirty?" He stepped into the kitchen, closer than he needed to, his eyes flicking down to my hands as I scrubbed the countertop. "I don't mind a little dirt," he replied softly, and there was something in his voice that made my pulse quicken. I focused on my task, but his presence was impossible to ignore. The morning unfolded in an odd rhythm, each small movement and shared glance feeling charged with an energy I couldn't quite place. We worked side by side, tidying up the kitchen and chatting about mundane things, but there was an underlying tension, like we were both trying not to say something. It was unsettling yet thrilling in a way I hadn't felt before. After a while, I excused myself to grab a broom from the hall closet. When I returned, he was leaning against the counter, watching me with an expression that was hard to read. I busied myself with sweeping the floor, hoping he'd go back to his usual detached demeanor, but he just stayed there, arms crossed, studying me, as if I were a puzzle he was trying to solve. Finally, unable to take the silence any longer, I glanced up. "You're awfully quiet today." He tilted his head, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "Just thinking." "About what?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual, though my heart was beating a little faster than it should have been. He hesitated, then shrugged. "About how interesting this whole setup is." I raised an eyebrow, not entirely sure what he meant. "What setup?" "This," he gestured vaguely between us. "You, me, this whole step-sibling thing." My breath caught, and I looked away, focusing on a stubborn spot on the floor that didn't actually exist. "It's just new, I guess," I murmured, hoping he wouldn't push further. But he didn't let it go. "Is that all it is?" There was a pause, a long, loaded silence that hung between us, filled with all the things we weren't saying. I didn't dare look at him. Afraid he'd see something in my eyes I wasn't ready to admit to myself. But I couldn't help it. Curiosity got the best of me, and I stole a quick glance in his direction. His gaze was intense, and there was a flicker of something there, something that made my stomach flip. I felt the warmth in my cheeks again and quickly looked away, pretending to be engrossed in my sweeping. "You're blushing," he noted, his voice low, almost teasing. I forced a laugh, trying to play it off. "I am not." "Oh, you definitely are." He leaned forward, his tone playful but with an edge of something more. "What's got you all flustered, Jessica?" The way he said my name, the softness of his voice, it was almost too much. I swallowed, my mind racing for a way to steer the conversation back to safer territory. But before I could think of anything, he took a step closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him. "There's no need to be so shy," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. I froze, the broom slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. The sound snapped me out of whatever spell I was under, and I quickly stepped back, putting some distance between us. I could feel my cheeks burning, and I avoided his gaze, focusing on the broom at my feet. I should probably finish cleaning," I stammered, bending down to pick up the broom. My hands were trembling, and I hoped he didn't notice. "Right," he said, his voice returning to its usual casual tone, but I could still feel his eyes on me, and when I risked a glance, I saw a faint smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. I straightened, clutching the broom like it was a lifeline, and forced a smile. "Thanks for the help." He nodded, still watching me with that unreadable expression. "Anytime, Jessica." As he walked out of the kitchen, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My heart was racing, my mind spinning with thoughts I knew I shouldn't be having. I was grateful he was gone, but at the same time, I couldn't help but feel a pang of disappointment. Part of me wanted him to stay, to see how far this strange, forbidden tension would go. I shook my head, chastising myself for even thinking such things. This was ridiculous. He was my stepbrother. We were family now, or at least we were supposed to be. But as much as I tried to convince myself that I felt nothing for him, I couldn't deny the spark I'd felt when he was close. It was dangerous, reckless, and entirely out of bounds, but it was there, and that was enough to scare me. As I finished sweeping the floor, I couldn't shake the image of him standing close to me, his voice soft and teasing. The thought lingered in my mind, refusing to let go. And as much as I wanted to push it away, to forget the way he'd looked at me, I knew that something had shifted between us. The rest of the morning felt surreal. I moved through the house with mechanical motions, my mind stuck on a loop, replaying every glance and every word Alex and I had shared. It was like I was trapped in a daze, each room echoing the memory of him standing too close, watching me with that intense gaze. I tried to shake it off, to focus on my chores and ignore the nagging thoughts swirling in my mind. But every corner I turned, I half expected to see him standing there, leaning against the wall with that knowing smirk. It was silly, really just my imagination running wild. Yet I couldn't help but wonder if he felt it too, this strange pull that seemed to tighten every time we were alone together. Finally, I headed to the living room, hoping a change of scenery might clear my head. I was dusting the shelves when I heard his footsteps approaching. My heart skipped a beat, and I forced myself to keep my back turned, determined not to let him see how rattled I felt. "Still cleaning?" he asked, his voice casual, as if we hadn't just shared a moment that felt anything but ordinary. "Yep," I replied, trying to keep my tone light as I dusted a vase on the top shelf, trying to get everything done before they come back. He stepped closer, and I could feel the air around me shift. I focused on my task, refusing to look at him, even though every fiber of my being was hyper-aware of his presence. "Need a hand?" he offered, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. I forced a laugh, shaking my head. "I think I can handle it." He didn't move, though, and I felt a shiver run down my spine as I sensed him watching me. After a few seconds, he cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "You know," he began, his tone casual, but with an undercurrent of something deeper. "We don't really know each other that well, do we?" I turned, finally meeting his gaze, and saw something in his eyes that made my heart race. "I guess not," I murmured, caught off guard by the intensity of his stare. "Maybe we should change that," he said, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. There was a challenge in his eyes, a silent dare that made my pulse quicken. For a moment, I was tempted to let my guard down, to give in to the curiosity that had been simmering since the day we'd met. But then reality hit me like a splash of cold water. This was my stepbrother. We were family now, bound by our parents' marriage, and crossing that line was unthinkable. I forced a smile, hoping it would mask the turmoil brewing inside me. I don't think that's such a good idea. His smile faded slightly, but he held my gaze, his expression unreadable. Why not? Because I trailed off, searching for the right words. It's just complicated. He shrugged, his eyes never leaving mine. Sometimes complicated is interesting. There it was again, that undercurrent of something dangerous and thrilling. My mind was racing, my heart pounding as I struggled to keep my composure. I wanted to look away, to break the spell that seemed to hold us both in place, but I couldn't. His gaze was magnetic, drawing me in, and for a brief, reckless moment, I wondered what it would be like to give in. Finally, I broke eye contact, turning back to the shelf with a shaky laugh. You're impossible, you know that? He chuckled, the sound low and teasing. I've been called worse. There was a pause, a lingering silence that stretched between us, heavy with unspoken thoughts. I busied myself with dusting, trying to ignore the way my hands were trembling, but I could still feel his presence, warm and close. Jessica, he said, his tone softer now, almost vulnerable. You don't have to be so guarded around me. We're family now, remember. I bit my lip, feeling a pang of pain mixed with a flicker of something else, something I couldn't quite name. I know, it's just new. He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. It is, but that doesn't mean it has to be awkward. Awkward? I echoed, forcing a laugh. Why would it be awkward? He smirked, his eyes glinting with mischief. You tell me. I felt my cheeks flush, and I quickly turned away, hoping he wouldn't notice. You're ridiculous, I muttered, trying to keep my voice steady. Maybe, he said with a shrug, his tone light, but there was a hint of something more in his eyes, a flicker of amusement mixed with a spark of curiosity. But you're not exactly innocent either. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a surge of adrenaline that left me breathless. I wanted to deny it, to brush off his words as a joke, but there was a part of me that knew he was right. This feeling, this strange, forbidden attraction, it wasn't one-sided, and the realization was both thrilling and terrifying. I swallowed, forcing myself to meet his gaze. Whatever you're thinking, you're wrong, I said, my voice barely a whisper. He raised an eyebrow, his expression both amused and skeptical. Am I? I didn't answer. Instead, I turned back to my cleaning, hoping he would take the hint and leave. But he didn't move. He stayed there, watching me with that infuriating smirk, and I felt my resolve weakening with each passing second. Fine, he said finally, his tone light but with an edge that made my heart race. I'll leave you to your cleaning. For now. As he turned to leave, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My mind was racing, my heart pounding, and I felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment as I watched him walk away. But as I went back to my chores, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us, that a line had been crossed, even if only in our thoughts. And as much as I tried to push it away, I knew that this was only the beginning. The days that followed were a blur of stolen glances and unspoken words. I tried to stay busy, burying myself in chores and schoolwork, but I couldn't escape the memory of that morning with Alex. Every time I saw him, every time our eyes met across a room, I felt the same forbidden thrill, a rush of excitement mixed with guilt. And no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the feeling only seemed to grow stronger. It was late one evening, and the house was unusually quiet. My mom and Tom were out for a late dinner, leaving Alex and me alone again. I told myself it didn't matter, that I could keep my distance and stay in my room. But something compelled me to go downstairs. Maybe it was the silence, or maybe it was the chance to see him without anyone else around. Whatever it was, I found myself wandering into the living room, my heart pounding as I tried to act casual. I was pretending to scroll through my phone when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, and there he was, leaning against the doorway with that familiar smirk, his eyes locked onto mine. The tension between us was palpable, and for a moment neither of us spoke. It was like we were both waiting for the other to make a move, to break the silence that had grown thick with unspoken words. "You're up late," he said finally, his voice low. I shrugged, trying to sound nonchalant. "Couldn't sleep." He stepped closer, his gaze never leaving mine. "Funny. Me neither." There was a challenge in his eyes, a silent dare that made my pulse quicken. I told myself to look away, to walk back upstairs and put some distance between us, but my feet wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, caught in his gaze, unable to break the spell he seemed to have over me. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He shrugged, taking another step closer. "Just thinking." "About what?" He tilted his head, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "About you." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and I felt my cheeks flush. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was being ridiculous. But the truth was, I'd been thinking about him too, more than I should have, more than was safe. I swallowed, forcing myself to keep my voice steady. "You shouldn't say things like that." "Why not?" he asked, his tone casual but with an edge of something deeper. "Because," I trailed off, searching for the right words. "Because we're family." He raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "Are we?" My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a surge of adrenaline that left me breathless. "What are you saying?" He shrugged, his gaze intense. "I'm saying I don't feel like we are." The confession hit me like a jolt, and I felt a mix of emotions I couldn't quite name. I wanted to protest, to remind him that we shared a family now, but the words caught in my throat, because deep down I knew he was right. This whatever it was between us didn't feel like family. It felt like something else entirely. Before I could respond, he reached out, his fingers brushing against mine. The touch was light, almost tentative, but it sent a shockwave through me, and I felt my breath hitch. I knew I should pull away, that this was a line we couldn't cross. But my body seemed to have a mind of its own, leaning into his touch, craving the warmth of his hand. "Jessica," he murmured, his voice soft, almost pleading. My mind was racing, torn between the thrill of the moment and the weight of my guilt. But as he looked at me, his eyes dark and full of something I couldn't name, I felt my resolve crumble. I wanted him in a way that defied logic, a way that I couldn't explain even to myself. And so, against every warning in my mind, I let myself lean closer, my heart racing as I felt his breath warm against my skin. It was reckless, dangerous, but in that moment, I didn't care. I was caught up in the thrill of the forbidden, in the allure of something I knew I shouldn't want. Then, just as our lips were about to meet, I pulled back, reality crashing down around me like a cold wave. I stepped away, my heart pounding, and shook my head, trying to clear the fog of desire that had clouded my thoughts. "We can't," I whispered, my voice barely audible. This isn't right." He looked at me, his expression unreadable, and for a moment I thought he was going to argue. But then he nodded, a hint of disappointment flickering in his eyes. "Maybe you're right," he murmured, his voice soft. I felt a pang of regret, a flicker of something that felt dangerously close to longing. But I forced myself to look away. "Good night, Alex." Without waiting for his response, I turned and walked back upstairs, my heart racing and my mind a whirlwind of emotions. I knew I'd made the right choice, that I'd stopped things before they went too far, but I couldn't shake the feeling of loss, the sense that I'd walked away from something I'd won more than I was willing to admit. The next few days were a blur of avoidance and stolen glances. I did my best to keep my distance from Alex, to avoid any situation that might lead to another moment like the one we'd shared. But it was harder than I thought it would be. Every time I saw him, I felt the same forbidden thrill, the same pull that seemed to draw us together, despite the invisible wall I was trying so hard to build between us. We never spoke about what had happened that night, but the memory lingered, a silent presence that hung between us like a ghost. I could see it in his eyes, feel it in the way he looked at me when he thought no one was watching. It was like we'd made some unspoken agreement, a pact to keep our secret buried but never truly forgotten. One evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, I heard him enter the kitchen. My heart skipped a beat, and I kept my back to him, hoping he wouldn't notice the way my hands were trembling as I scrubbed the dishes. "Need any help?" he asked, his tone casual. I shook my head, keeping my focus on the sink. "I've got it." He was quiet for a moment, and I could feel his gaze on me, heavy and searching. Finally, he spoke, his voice soft. "About the other night." I froze, my heart racing. I knew this conversation was coming, but I wasn't ready for it, not yet. "We don't have to talk about it," I said quickly, hoping to cut him off before he could say anything that would make it harder to ignore the truth. "But we do," he replied, his tone firm but gentle. "We can't just pretend it didn't happen." I turned to face him, my hands still damp from the sink, and met his gaze. There was a vulnerability in his eyes, a softness I hadn't seen before, and it left me feeling exposed, like he could see right through the walls I'd built around myself. "What do you want me to say?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He stepped closer, his gaze intense. "I want you to tell me the truth." I swallowed, feeling my resolve weakening under the weight of his stare. "The truth is, I don't know." He looked at me, his expression a mix of frustration and understanding. "I don't either," he admitted, his voice soft. "But I can't ignore this, Jessica. I can't pretend that I don't feel something." The confession hung in the air, heavy and full of meaning, and I felt my heart racing as I struggled to process his words. Part of me wanted to deny it, to brush off his feelings as a momentary lapse in judgment, but the truth was, I felt it too. I just wasn't ready to face it. After a long silence, I finally nodded, my voice barely audible. "I don't know what this is, Alex, but maybe it's best if we just keep our distance." He looked at me, his expression pained but resolute. "Is that what you really want?" I hesitated, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Finally, I forced myself to nod, even though my heart was screaming a different answer. "Yes, it's for the best." He watched me for a moment longer, then nodded, a hint of sadness flickering in his eyes. "All right, if that's what you want." As he turned to leave, I felt a pang of regret, a sense of loss that left me feeling hollow. I knew I'd made the right choice, that keeping our distance was the only way to preserve what little stability our family had. But as I watched him walk away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd walked away from something that can never be replaced. The days slipped by in a strange rhythm, each one thick with the tension that had been growing between Alex and me. We did our best to avoid each other, keeping our interactions to a minimum, but the pull was there, undeniable and ever-present. It was like a magnetic force that kept drawing us together, no matter how hard we tried to resist. One evening, as I was cleaning up the living room after my mom and Tom had gone to bed, I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know it was him. I could feel his presence, that familiar warmth that made my skin prickle and my pulse quicken. I continued dusting the shelves, hoping he would take the hint and leave. But he stayed, silent and unmoving, watching me with that intense gaze I had come to both fear and crave. "Jessica," he said finally, his voice barely more than a whisper. I froze, my heart pounding as I forced myself to keep my back to him. "What is it, Alex?" There was a pause, and I could sense him weighing his words carefully. I can't keep pretending that nothing's going on here. I closed my eyes, swallowing against the knot of emotion tightening in my throat. I knew what he was talking about, but I wasn't ready to face it. "There's nothing to talk about," I replied, my voice trembling slightly. He stepped closer, and I felt his presence behind me like a physical weight. "You don't believe that any more than I do." I turned slowly, meeting his gaze, and for a moment, all the reasons why this was wrong seemed to fade away. All I could see was him, the way his eyes softened as he looked at me, the warmth in his gaze that made my heart race. I knew I should walk away, put some distance between us, but my feet wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, caught in his gaze, unable to tear myself away. "We can't do this," I whispered, though my voice lacked conviction. He took another step forward, his eyes never leaving mine. Why not? Because I trailed off, struggling to find the words. Because it's wrong. We're family now. He shook his head, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Are we, though? I mean, we barely know each other. We're only family because our parents got married. That doesn't change anything about us. I felt a surge of frustration, a mix of anger and desire that left me feeling dizzy. It changes everything, Alex. People would think. Let them think what they want, he interrupted, his voice firm. I don't care what anyone else thinks. I care about what we feel, what I feel. And I think you feel it too. The confession hung in the air, heavy and charged with meaning. I wanted to deny it, to brush off his words as a momentary lapse in judgment. But the truth was, I felt it too. And no matter how hard I tried to push it away, the feeling only seemed to grow stronger. I don't know what I feel, I murmured, my voice barely audible. He looked at me, his gaze softening, and I felt my heart ache with a mixture of longing and fear. It's okay not to know, but don't run away from it. Don't run away from me. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and before I could stop myself, I took a step forward, closing the distance between us. My heart was racing, my mind a whirlwind of emotions, but in that moment, all I cared about was him. The way he looked at me with such intensity, such longing. Without thinking, I reached up, my fingers brushing against his cheek, and he closed his eyes, leaning into my touch. The world around us seemed to fade away, and all I could feel was the warmth of his skin beneath my fingertips, the steady beat of his heart as he took a shaky breath. Jessica, he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. I didn't answer. Instead, I let my hand trail down to his shoulder, feeling the warmth of his body against mine, the steady strength that grounded me even as my heart raced. He opened his eyes, and the look in them left me breathless, a mixture of vulnerability and desire that mirrored my own. In that moment, I knew I was standing at the edge of something dangerous, something I couldn't take back. But I didn't care. All that mattered was him. The way he looked at me. The way his fingers gently traced a path along my arm, sending shivers down my spine. And then, as if pulled by an invisible force, our lips met in a kiss that was soft and tentative at first, a hesitant exploration of something we both knew was forbidden. But as the kiss deepened, the tension that had been building between us finally broke, and I felt a surge of desire that left me breathless. For a brief, reckless moment, I allowed myself to get lost in him, in the warmth of his embrace, the way his arms wrapped around me, holding me close as if he was afraid to let go. I knew I should pull away, that this was a line we couldn't cross, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. I was caught up in the thrill of the forbidden, in the allure of something I knew I shouldn't want. But then, as reality began to creep back in, I felt a pang of guilt that left me feeling hollow. I pulled away, my heart racing as I struggled to catch my breath. I looked at him, and the look in his eyes mirrored my own, a mixture of longing and regret, of desire and fear. We can't do this," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving mine. "I know." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that left me feeling like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, one step away from falling into something I couldn't control. I knew we needed to put some distance between us, to stop this before it went too far, but a part of me didn't want to let go. "What are we going to do?" I asked, my voice trembling. He looked at me, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe we just take things one day at a time, see where it goes." I shook my head, feeling a mix of frustration and sadness. "That's not a plan, Alex. That's just asking for trouble." Maybe, he admitted, his tone soft. "But I don't want to lose you." The confession hit me like a jolt, and I felt a pang of sadness that left me feeling hollow. I knew he was right, that we had something rare, something that went beyond words. But I also knew that pursuing it would mean risking everything: our family, our future, our own hearts. "I don't want to lose you either," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. He smiled, a sad, knowing smile that broke my heart. Then maybe we just keep this between us. No one else needs to know. The suggestion was reckless, dangerous, but in that moment, I didn't care. I wanted him in a way that defied logic, a way that I couldn't explain, even to myself. All right, I agreed, feeling a thrill of excitement mixed with a pang of guilt. But we have to be careful. No one can know. He nodded, his gaze intense. I promise? And with that, we made our unspoken agreement, a pact to keep our secret buried, to let this forbidden attraction simmer beneath the surface, where no one else could see. It was dangerous, reckless, and entirely out of bounds, but in that moment I didn't care. All I cared about was him. The way he looked at me. The way his hand lingered on mine as we said our quiet goodbye. As I walked back upstairs, my heart racing and my mind a whirlwind of emotions, I knew that we had crossed a line, that there was no turning back now. We were bound by a secret, a forbidden desire that defied all reason, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The secret hung between us, unspoken yet ever present, a silent reminder of the line we'd crossed and the pact we'd made to keep it hidden. Every glance, every accidental touch seemed to pulse with the memory of that night, each moment spent together a reminder of the tension simmering just beneath the surface. Days turned into weeks, and though we tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, the weight of our secret only grew heavier. Every family dinner, every shared moment in the same room, became a delicate dance of stolen glances and hidden smiles, both of us teetering on the edge of discovery. I knew it was dangerous, that one slip could bring everything crashing down, but the thrill of it, the thrill of knowing we shared something no one else could understand, made it impossible to resist. Then came the day when the tension finally snapped. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was home alone, tidying up the house while my mom and Tom were out running errands. I'd just finished wiping down the kitchen counter when I heard the door open and turned to see Alex standing there, watching me with that familiar intensity that left my heart racing. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my tone casual as I turned back to the counter, busying myself with putting away the cleaning supplies. He didn't respond right away, and when I glanced over my shoulder, I saw him standing there, his gaze fixed on me in a way that made my stomach flutter. I tried to ignore it, to brush it off as nothing more than a lingering look, but the air between us felt charged, the silence thick with unspoken words. Finally, he took a step closer, his expression unreadable. "Jessica, we need to talk." I froze, my hand hovering over the countertop, my heart pounding as I forced myself to turn and face him. "About what?" He ran a hand through his hair, looking almost nervous, an unusual sight, considering how calm and collected he usually was. "About this. Us, whatever this is." I swallowed, feeling my cheeks flush as I struggled to find the right words. "I thought we agreed to just keep things quiet." "I know," he replied, his voice soft, almost vulnerable. "But it's not that simple. I can't just pretend this isn't happening." I felt a surge of panic, my mind racing as I tried to think of a way to deflect, to steer the conversation back to safer territory. But his gaze was unrelenting, his expression a mixture of frustration and longing that left me feeling exposed, like he could see right through the walls I'd built around myself. "Alex," I began, my voice barely a whisper, "we can't keep doing this. It's too dangerous." He shook his head, his eyes dark with emotion. "Maybe. But I don't care. I can't ignore this anymore. I can't pretend I don't feel something real." The confession hit me like a jolt, and I felt my heart race with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. I wanted to deny it, to brush off his words as nothing more than a momentary lapse in judgment. But the truth was, I felt it too. I felt it in every glance, every accidental touch, every stolen moment we shared. I took a deep breath, struggling to keep my voice steady. "What are you saying, Alex?" He looked at me, his expression softening, and for a moment, I saw a vulnerability in his eyes that left me feeling breathless. "I'm saying that I don't want to hide this anymore. I don't want to pretend that we're just siblings." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and I felt a pang of guilt mixed with a surge of desire that left me feeling dizzy. I knew this was wrong, that we were crossing a line we could never uncross. But a part of me didn't care. A part of me wanted him in a way that defied all reason. Alex, if anyone found out, I trailed off, the implications of our actions sinking in. I know, he said, his tone firm. But I don't care. Let them think what they want. I only care about what I feel. The intensity in his gaze left me feeling vulnerable, like he could see right through every defense I had tried to build. I wanted to deny it, to brush off his words, but the truth was, I felt it too. I just wasn't ready to face it. What do you want me to say? I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He took another step closer, his eyes never leaving mine. I want you to tell me the truth. I want you to tell me what you really feel. I felt a surge of frustration, a mixture of anger and desire that left me feeling dizzy. What I feel like this is a mistake. I feel like we're walking into something that's only going to hurt us. He looked at me, his expression a mixture of pain and determination. Maybe. But I'd rather face that than keep pretending that there's nothing between us. His words left me breathless, a mix of fear and longing that left me feeling vulnerable. I wanted to argue, to deny what he was saying, but the truth was, I felt it too. I just wasn't ready to admit it. After a long silence, I finally nodded, my voice barely audible. I don't know what this is, Alex. But maybe you're right. Maybe we can't ignore it. The words were barely out of my mouth before he closed the distance between us, his lips meeting mine in a kiss that was both fierce and tender, a silent confession of all the things we hadn't dared to say. I felt a surge of desire, a reckless thrill that left me breathless, and for a moment, I let myself get lost in him, in the warmth of his embrace, the feel of his hands against my skin. But as the kiss deepened, reality began to creep back in, and I felt a pang of guilt that left me feeling hollow. I pulled away, my heart racing as I struggled to catch my breath. We can't do this, I whispered, my voice trembling. He looked at me, his expression a mixture of frustration and sadness. Why not? Because it's wrong, I replied, my voice barely more than a whisper. We're family now, Alex. We can't just ignore that. He shook his head, his gaze intense. We're only family because our parents got married. That doesn't change how I feel, how you feel. I felt a surge of frustration, a mix of anger and longing that left me feeling dizzy. What are you saying? That we just ignore everything? That we keep sneaking around, hoping no one finds out? He looked at me, his expression softening. Maybe we just let ourselves be happy, even if it's only for a little while. The words hit me like a jolt, a mixture of fear and longing that left me feeling breathless. I wanted to deny it, to brush off his words as nothing more than a momentary lapse in judgment, but the truth was, I wanted it too. I wanted him. I took a deep breath, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of my feelings. I don't know if I can do that, Alex. I don't know if I can live with the guilt. He nodded, his gaze softening. I know, but maybe it's worth it. I looked at him, my heart racing, as I struggled to make sense of my emotions. A part of me wanted to run, to escape the weight of the secret we shared, but another part of me was drawn to him, to the forbidden thrill of our connection. And in that moment, I knew that no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't walk away. The hours after that confession felt like a blur. I couldn't focus on anything. My thoughts were a whirlwind of what Alex had said, the intensity of his gaze, the way his words had echoed what I'd felt but was too afraid to admit. For the rest of that day, I stayed in my room, trying to distance myself from everything. But his words replayed in my mind, each repetition peeling away a layer of my resolve. Maybe it's worth it. The weight of that possibility lingered, and I found myself wondering if he was right. Maybe this was more than a fleeting attraction. Maybe this was something we needed to experience, even if it was only for a little while. Night had fallen by the time I finally ventured out of my room. The house was silent, and the only light came from the dim glow of the living room lamp. I tiptoed down the hallway, feeling like an intruder in my own home, every creak of the floorboards sounding louder in the quiet. As I reached the living room, I stopped short, my heart racing as I saw him sitting on the couch, his back to me, his posture tense. He didn't hear me approach, and for a moment, I stood there, watching him, my mind racing. I could see the weight of his thoughts in the way his shoulders hunched, the way his head was bowed slightly. He looked lost, like he was carrying the same burden I was, and a surge of emotion swept over me, empathy, desire, and something else, something deeper that I couldn't quite name. Finally, I cleared my throat, and he turned, his eyes widening slightly as he saw me standing there. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence between us thick with unspoken words. Then, slowly, he stood, closing the distance between us until we were only inches apart. "You're up late," he murmured, his voice barely more than a whisper. I swallowed, my heart pounding as I struggled to find my voice. I couldn't sleep. He nodded, his gaze intense as he searched my eyes. Me neither. The air between us felt electric, charged with a tension that had been building for days, weeks, maybe even longer. I knew I should walk away, put some distance between us before we crossed another line we couldn't uncross, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I was rooted to the spot, caught in his gaze, unable to look away. "What are we doing, Alex?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He hesitated, his eyes dark with emotion. "I don't know, but I can't stop thinking about you, Jessica." The confession left me breathless, a mixture of fear and exhilaration washing over me. I wanted to deny it, to brush off his words as nothing more than a passing thought, but the truth was, I felt it too, and no matter how hard I tried to push it away, the feeling only grew stronger. I feel it too," I admitted, my voice barely more than a whisper. He took a step closer, his gaze never leaving mine, and I felt my heart race as he reached out, his hand gently cupping my cheek. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver down my spine, and for a brief, reckless moment, I allowed myself to get lost in him, in the warmth of his skin, the steadiness of his gaze. "You don't have to be afraid," he murmured, his voice soft, soothing. I closed my eyes, letting his words wash over me, feeling the weight of my fear and guilt begin to melt away. I knew this was wrong, that we were standing on the edge of something dangerous, but in that moment I didn't care. All I cared about was him, the way he looked at me, the way his hand felt against my skin. And then, as if pulled by an invisible force, our lips met in a kiss that was soft and tender, a tentative exploration of something we both knew was forbidden. But as the kiss deepened, the tension that had been building between us finally broke, and I felt a surge of desire that left me breathless. For a moment, I let myself get lost in him, in the warmth of his embrace, the feel of his hands against my skin as he pulled me closer. I knew I should pull away, that this was a line we couldn't cross, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. I was caught up in the thrill of the forbidden, in the allure of something I knew I shouldn't want. He pulled me down onto the couch, his arms wrapping around me as our kiss deepened, and I felt a reckless thrill that left me breathless, a mixture of fear and exhilaration that made my head spin. It was dangerous, reckless, but in that moment, I didn't care. I wanted him in a way that defied logic, a way that I couldn't explain, even to myself. As our kisses grew more intense, a part of me knew we were crossing a line, that there would be no turning back from this. But I couldn't bring myself to stop, to let go of the thrill of being with him, of feeling his touch against my skin. I was lost in him, in the heat of the moment, in the thrill of giving in to something I'd tried so hard to resist. And then, as reality began to creep back in, I felt a pang of guilt that left me feeling hollow. I pulled away, my heart racing as I struggled to catch my breath, feeling the weight of what we'd just done settle over me like a heavy blanket. We shouldn't have done that," I whispered, my voice trembling. He looked at me, his expression a mixture of frustration and sadness. "I know, but I don't regret it." The confession hit me like a jolt, and I felt a pang of sadness that left me feeling hollow. I wanted to argue, to tell him that this was a mistake, but a part of me didn't believe it. A part of me wanted to stay, to let myself get lost in him, in the thrill of what we'd just shared. I don't know what to do, I admitted, my voice barely audible. He reached out, his hand gently brushing against my cheek. Then maybe we don't do anything. Maybe we just let this be what it is. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that left me feeling like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, one step away from falling into something I couldn't control. I knew I should walk away, put some distance between us before things went too far, but a part of me didn't want to let go. What if someone finds out? I asked, my voice trembling. He shook his head, his gaze steady. No one will find out. This is just between us. The promise was reckless, dangerous, but in that moment I didn't care. I wanted him in a way that defied all reason. And as I looked into his eyes, I knew that no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't walk away. All right, I agreed, feeling a thrill of excitement mixed with a pang of guilt. But we have to be careful. He nodded, his gaze intense. I promise. And with that, we sealed our unspoken agreement, a silent pact to keep our secret hidden, to let ourselves get lost in each other for however long this could last. It was dangerous, reckless, but in that moment it felt like the only thing that mattered. As I lay there in his arms, feeling the warmth of his embrace, the steady beat of his heart, I knew we were standing on the edge of something we couldn't control. But for now I was willing to let go, to let myself be swept away by the thrill of the forbidden, even if it meant risking everything. The days that followed were a strange mix of excitement and dread. Alex and I had crossed a line, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the memory of that night lingered, haunting me in quiet moments, creeping into my thoughts when I least expected it. Every glance, every brush of our hands held a deeper meaning now, a secret that only we shared. But with the thrill came a crushing sense of guilt. Each time I sat down to dinner with our parents, each time I heard my mother laugh with Tom, I felt a pang of remorse that twisted in my chest, making it hard to breathe. I kept expecting someone to notice, to see the guilt written on my face, to sense that something had changed. The fear of being discovered gnawed at me, and I found myself glancing at Alex more often, searching for any hint that he felt the same weight pressing down on him. One evening, as we were all sitting in the living room, Tom brought out a stack of old family photos, eager to share stories from his childhood. My mom was delighted, laughing at every picture, her eyes sparkling with warmth and affection. I sat beside her, forcing myself to smile, but my mind was elsewhere, my heart racing as I stole a glance at Alex across the room. He was sitting on the other side of the couch, his expression unreadable, but I could see the tension in his posture, the way his hands clenched and unclenched as he watched our parents laugh together. I wondered if he felt the same guilt, the same suffocating fear that had wrapped itself around me like a vice. Jessica, my mom's voice pulled me back to the present, and I turned to find her holding up a picture, her eyes bright with excitement. Look at this. Tom and I went to this lake last summer, you should see it. It's beautiful. I forced a smile, nodding along as she described the trip in detail, but my mind was elsewhere. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was betraying her, that I was hiding something so monumental that it would shatter everything if she ever found out. The weight of it pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe, and I felt a pang of guilt so intense that I almost had to look away. Finally, I excused myself, mumbling something about needing a drink of water, and hurried into the kitchen. I leaned against the counter, taking slow, deep breaths, trying to steady myself. The guilt was suffocating, a constant reminder of the line we'd crossed, the secret we were both trying so hard to keep. A moment later, I heard footsteps behind me, and I turned to see Alex standing in the doorway, his expression as tense and conflicted as my own. He didn't say anything, but his eyes held a question, a silent inquiry that I knew all too well. He was feeling it too, the weight of our actions, the suffocating guilt that had settled over us like a heavy cloud. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. I nodded, though the answer was far from the truth. I'm fine. Just needed a minute." He stepped closer, his gaze filled with concern, and for a brief moment, the distance between us seemed to dissolve, replaced by the familiar warmth, the unspoken connection that had drawn us together in the first place. But then the reality of the situation crashed down on me, and I pulled back, wrapping my arms around myself as if to create a barrier between us. We can't keep doing this, Alex, I whispered, my voice trembling. It's tearing me apart. He looked at me, his expression pained, and I could see the conflict in his eyes, the same battle that was raging inside me. I know, he murmured, his voice filled with regret, but I don't know how to stop. The confession hung in the air, and I felt a pang of sadness, a deep, aching sorrow that left me feeling hollow. I knew he was right, that despite the guilt, despite the fear, we were both drawn to each other in a way that defied logic, a way that neither of us could fully control. But the reality of our situation was inescapable, a constant reminder of the line we'd crossed and the consequences we would have to face if anyone ever found out. We have to stop, Alex, I said finally, my voice barely more than a whisper, before it's too late. He nodded slowly, his gaze filled with sadness. You're probably right. But even as he said the words, I could see the reluctance in his eyes, the lingering desire that mirrored my own. We both knew what needed to be done, but the thought of letting go, of walking away from each other, felt like a loss too painful to bear. Just as he was about to respond, we heard footsteps approaching, and we both froze, the weight of our secret pressing down on us as our mom walked into the kitchen, oblivious to the tension that filled the room. Hey, you too, she said with a warm smile, her eyes darting between us. Everything okay? I forced a smile, nodding quickly. Yeah, just needed a drink of water. She didn't seem to notice the strain in my voice, and I let out a silent sigh of relief as she turned back toward the living room, calling for us to join them for a family game night. I nodded, my heart racing as I glanced at Alex, the unspoken tension between us thicker than ever. As we followed her back into the living room, I felt the weight of our secret settle over me, like a heavy cloud, suffocating and inescapable. I knew that we couldn't keep this up, that eventually the truth would come to light, but a part of me wasn't ready to let go. A part of me was still clinging to the thrill, the forbidden excitement that had drawn us together in the first place. The evening wore on, and we sat around the coffee table, playing a board game while our parents laughed and joked, blissfully unaware of the tension simmering beneath the surface. I tried to focus, to laugh along and pretend that everything was normal, but my mind kept drifting, my gaze flickering to Alex every few minutes, my heart racing with every stolen glance. Each time our eyes met, I felt a surge of emotion, guilt, longing, and something darker, a fear that our secret would unravel, that we would be caught in the web we'd spun around ourselves. I tried to push the thoughts away, to focus on the game, but the tension was impossible to ignore, a constant reminder of the line we'd crossed and the consequences we would have to face. Finally, the game ended, and I excused myself, claiming I needed to get some air. I stepped out onto the back porch, the cool night air a welcome relief from the suffocating atmosphere inside. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart, but the guilt and fear were still there, gnawing at me, a constant reminder of the weight of our actions. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps behind me, and I turned to see Alex standing in the doorway, his expression as conflicted as my own. He didn't say anything, but his presence was enough to shatter the fragile calm I'd managed to find, and I felt a surge of anger, frustration, and helplessness wash over me. What are we doing, Alex? I whispered, my voice filled with anguish. This isn't normal. We're tearing ourselves apart. He looked at me, his gaze filled with sadness. I know, but I don't know how to stop. The words left me feeling hollow, a deep ache settling in my chest as I realized the truth of his confession. We were both caught in a web of our own making, trapped in a situation that had spiraled out of control, and no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't find a way out. I can't keep doing this, I murmured, my voice trembling. I can't keep lying, pretending that everything's okay. He nodded slowly, his gaze softening. Then maybe we need to make a choice. Either we end this, or we find a way to live with it. The suggestion hit me like a jolt, a mixture of fear and longing twisting in my chest as I considered his words. A part of me knew he was right, that we couldn't keep living in this limbo, constantly on edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But the thought of letting go, of walking away from him, felt like a loss too painful to bear. "I don't know if I can live with this guilt, Alex," I admitted, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." He reached out, his hand gently brushing against my cheek, and I felt a shiver run down my spine at his touch. Then maybe we need to find a way to make it work. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and I felt my heart race as I looked into his eyes, the depth of his gaze leaving me feeling vulnerable, exposed. I knew that we were standing on the edge of something dangerous, that there would be no turning back if we continued down this path. But in that moment, I didn't care. All I cared about was him. The way he looked at me, the warmth of his touch, the thrill of the forbidden connection we shared. The next few days were a dizzying cycle of guilt and longing. I'd made up my mind countless times to walk away, to end things with Alex and try to regain a sense of normalcy. But every time I resolved to put an end to it, something pulled me back, a force I couldn't understand and didn't know how to fight. Each stolen glance, each accidental touch reminded me of what we shared, and despite the turmoil, I found myself drawn back into the secrecy of it all. It was late one night, and I was alone in my room, trying to distract myself with a book, but my mind kept wandering, thoughts of him creeping in no matter how hard I tried to push them away. The house was quiet, my mom and Tom had gone to bed hours ago, and I'd heard Alex go into his room earlier, so I assumed he was asleep too. Then, just as I was about to turn off my bedside lamp, I heard a soft knock on my door. My heart raced, and for a moment I debated ignoring it, pretending I was already asleep. But the knock came again, gentle yet insistent, and I felt that familiar pull, the same magnetic force that had been haunting me since our first encounter. I opened the door, and there he was, standing in the dim hallway light, his expression tense but filled with that same undeniable longing I'd seen so many times before. He didn't say anything, but his gaze was enough, a silent plea that left me feeling breathless, trapped between the weight of my guilt and the strength of my desire. "Can I come in?" he asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated, glancing back toward my bed, as if letting him in would be crossing yet another line we'd tried so hard to maintain. But then he took a step closer, and I felt my resolve waver, the warmth of his presence drawing me in like a flame. Without a word, I stepped aside, letting him in and closing the door quietly behind him. The silence was thick, the air charged with tension as we stood there, facing each other in the dim glow of my bedside lamp. He looked at me, his eyes dark and filled with emotion, and I felt a shiver run down my spine as he reached out, his hand brushing against my arm. "Jessica, I can't stop thinking about you," he confessed, his voice soft but heavy with meaning. I closed my eyes, swallowing against the knot in my throat. "Alex, we said we'd stop." "I know," he replied, his voice trembling slightly. "But I don't know how to. I don't know how to just pretend this never happened." His words hit me like a jolt, a mixture of fear and longing twisting in my chest as I realized the depth of his feelings mirrored my own. I wanted to deny it, to push him away and end this once and for all, but the truth was, I felt the same way. I couldn't just forget him, couldn't erase the connection we shared, no matter how much I tried. Slowly, almost unconsciously, I reached out, my hand finding his as I looked into his eyes, feeling a surge of emotion that left me breathless. We both knew this was dangerous, that we were playing with fire, but the pull between us was undeniable, a force that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. And so, in the quiet darkness of my room, we gave in once more, drawn together by a connection that defied reason, a desire that was as forbidden as it was irresistible. Every touch, every whispered word felt like a release, a momentary escape from the guilt and fear that had been haunting us. But even as we lost ourselves in each other, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that we were only digging ourselves deeper, that the consequences of our actions were looming just out of reach, waiting to catch up with us. When the moment passed, we lay there in silence, both of us lost in our thoughts, the weight of our secret settling over us like a heavy blanket. I knew that this couldn't go on, that eventually we would have to face the reality of our situation. But for now, I was content to stay here, to hold on to him for just a little while longer. But as the days went by, the strain of keeping our secret began to take its toll. Every family dinner, every shared moment with our parents became a test of my resolve, a reminder of the line we'd crossed and the consequences we'd soon have to face. I found myself growing more paranoid, jumping at every sound, every glance, fearing that someone would see the truth written on my face. And it wasn't just me. Alex, too, seemed to be feeling the weight of our actions. He was quieter than usual, his expression tense whenever we were around others, and I could see the strain in his eyes, the guilt and fear that mirrored my own. It was as if the secret we shared had become a prison, trapping us in a web of lies and half-truths, leaving us both feeling hollow and empty. Then, one evening, the tension finally came to a head. We were sitting in the living room, my mom and Tom chatting happily while Alex and I sat in silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts. I could feel the strain between us, a tension that had been building for days, and I knew that we couldn't keep this up. The weight of our secret was suffocating, a constant reminder of the line we'd crossed and the consequences we were now facing. Finally, unable to take it any longer, I stood up, mumbling something about needing to get some air, and hurried outside. I leaned against the porch railing, taking deep breaths, trying to steady my racing heart. The guilt and fear were overwhelming, a constant reminder of the choice we'd made, and I felt a surge of regret that left me feeling hollow. A moment later, I heard footsteps behind me, and I turned to see Alex standing there, his expression as conflicted as my own. He didn't say anything, but his presence was enough to shatter the fragile calm I'd managed to find, and I felt a surge of anger, frustration, and helplessness wash over me. "This is tearing us apart, Alex," I whispered, my voice filled with anguish. "We can't keep doing this." He looked at me, his gaze filled with sadness. "I know, but I don't know how to stop." His confession left me feeling hollow, a deep ache settling in my chest as I realized the truth of his words. We were both trapped, caught in a web of our own making, and no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't find a way out. "We need to end this," I said finally, my voice trembling, "before it's too late." He nodded slowly, his gaze softening. "Maybe you're right." But even as he said the words, I could see the reluctance in his eyes, the lingering desire that mirrored my own. We both knew what needed to be done, but the thought of letting go, of walking away from each other, felt like a loss too painful to bear. As we stood there in the darkness, I felt a surge of sadness, a deep, aching sorrow that left me feeling hollow. We were both caught in a situation we couldn't control, trapped in a cycle of guilt and desire that seemed to have no end. And as much as I wanted to find a way out, to put an end to the turmoil that had been tearing us apart, a part of me wasn't ready to let go. I don't know if I can do this," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He looked at me, his expression filled with understanding. "Then maybe we just take it one day at a time." The suggestion was simple, but it carried a weight that left me feeling like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, one step away from falling into something I couldn't control. I knew that we were treading dangerous ground, that our secret was a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. But in that moment, I didn't care. All I cared about was him. The way he looked at me, the warmth of his presence, the thrill of the forbidden connection we shared. And so we continued our unspoken agreement, a silent pact to keep our secret hidden, to let ourselves get lost in each other for however long this could last. It was dangerous, reckless, but in that moment it felt like the only thing that mattered. As we walked back inside, I felt the weight of our secret settle over me once more, suffocating and inescapable. But a part of me wasn't ready to let go, wasn't ready to face the reality of our situation. And as I glanced at Alex, his gaze filled with the same longing and guilt that mirrored my own, I knew that our story was far from over, that the consequences of our actions were still waiting, lurking just out of reach, ready to unravel everything we'd fought so hard to keep hidden. The strain of keeping our secret was beginning to show. Every day felt like a delicate balancing act, a constant game of pretense where one wrong move could expose everything. Alex and I had grown skilled at the charade, passing each other in the hall with polite indifference, sitting across from each other at family meals, without so much as a glance that could reveal what lay beneath the surface. But the tension was becoming unbearable, and I knew it was only a matter of time before something gave. The weight of our secret had settled into every corner of my life, a constant reminder of the forbidden connection we shared. And as careful as we'd been, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone would see through the facade, that one misstep would bring everything crashing down. It happened one Saturday afternoon, when the house was unusually quiet. My mom and Tom had gone out for the day, leaving Alex and me alone with the false comfort of solitude. I told myself I would stay in my room, that I wouldn't risk being alone with him, but the pull was too strong. I found myself wandering downstairs, unable to resist the urge to seek him out. He was in the living room, sitting on the couch with a book in his hands, but his gaze was distant, unfocused, as if his mind was elsewhere. The sight of him filled me with a strange mixture of relief and longing, and before I knew it, I was standing in the doorway, watching him with a tenderness I couldn't hide. When he noticed me, his expression softened, and he closed the book, setting it aside as he rose to his feet. We didn't speak. Words felt unnecessary, even dangerous. Instead, he crossed the room in a few quiet steps, and I felt my heart race as he reached for my hand, his touch gentle, but filled with a quiet urgency. "Jessica," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, as if saying my name out loud would shatter the fragile calm that surrounded us. I closed my eyes, savoring the warmth of his touch, the steadiness of his presence. For a brief, stolen moment, everything else faded away: the guilt, the fear, the constant weight of our secret. All that mattered was him, the way he looked at me, the way his hand felt in mine. But then, just as he leaned in, the quiet was shattered by the sound of the front door opening. My eyes flew open, and we both froze, a jolt of terror racing through me as I heard my mom's voice echo from the entryway. "We're back early," she called out, her voice cheerful and oblivious to the tension that had filled the room moments before. Panic surged through me, and I pulled my hand from his grasp, taking a step back just as my mom walked into the living room. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing as I tried to appear calm, to hide the turmoil that was raging beneath the surface. "Oh, hey, you two," she said, smiling as she set her purse down on the table. "What have you been up to?" "Nothing much," I replied quickly, my voice a little too high-pitched. "Just reading." She glanced between us, her smile fading slightly as her eyes narrowed, a hint of suspicion flickering in her gaze. I felt a chill run down my spine as she looked from me to Alex, her expression unreadable. "You two seem a bit jumpy," she said, a note of concern creeping into her voice. "Is everything okay?" I forced a laugh, trying to mask the panic that had settled in my chest. "Of course, Mom. Everything's fine." She studied me for a moment longer, her gaze lingering on my face, and I felt a surge of fear that she could see right through me, that somehow she knew what I was hiding. But then she seemed to brush it off, her smile returning as she turned back toward the kitchen. "All right, if you say so," she said lightly. "I'll just go put the groceries away." As she disappeared down the hall, I let out a shaky breath, my heart racing as I glanced at Alex. His expression was tense, his eyes filled with the same fear I felt. And I knew that he, too, understood how close we'd come to being discovered. "We need to be more careful," he whispered, his voice filled with urgency. I nodded, the reality of our situation crashing down on me like a wave. I know, that was too close. The weight of his gaze was heavy, and I could see the conflict in his eyes, the same mixture of fear and desire that had been haunting us both. We both knew what needed to be done, that we needed to put an end to this before it went too far, but neither of us seemed capable of letting go. "I don't want to lose this," he murmured, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't want to lose you." The confession left me breathless, a mixture of longing and guilt twisting in my chest as I looked into his eyes. I wanted to tell him that I felt the same way, that I was just as unwilling to let go. But the fear of discovery was a constant reminder of the consequences we would have to face. "Alex," I began, my voice trembling. We can't keep doing this." He nodded, his expression pained. "I know, but I don't know how to stop." The honesty in his words left me feeling vulnerable, exposed, and I felt a pang of sadness as I realized the depth of the connection we shared. It was a connection that defied logic, that went against everything we'd been taught, but it was real, and it was terrifying. "We'll figure it out," I whispered, trying to reassure both of us. "But we have to be careful. No more close calls." He nodded, his gaze softening as he looked at me, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "All right, we'll be careful." But even as he said the words, I could see the reluctance in his eyes, the same lingering desire that mirrored my own. We both knew that this was a temporary solution, that the tension between us was bound to reach a breaking point sooner or later. And as much as I wanted to believe we could keep this secret forever, a part of me knew that it was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the house grew tense, charged with an unspoken suspicion that hung in the air. I couldn't shake the feeling that my mom had noticed something during that close call, that she was watching me more closely, searching for signs of the secret I was trying so hard to keep hidden. I started avoiding her, finding excuses to stay out of her way, but her presence seemed inescapable. Her questions about my day, about my plans, laced with an intensity that left me feeling on edge. Every time she looked at me, I felt a surge of panic, a fear that she could see the guilt written on my face, that she somehow knew the truth of what I'd done. And it wasn't just me. Alex, too, seemed to be feeling the weight of her suspicion. He was quieter than usual, his gaze averted whenever we were in the same room, and I could see the tension in his posture, the strain of keeping our secret taking its toll on him. One evening, as we sat down for dinner, I felt her eyes on me, her gaze intense as she studied my face, her expression unreadable. I tried to ignore it, to focus on my food, but her silence was suffocating, a reminder of the growing suspicion that hung between us. "Jessica," she said finally, her voice quiet but laced with a hint of tension. "Is everything all right?" The question caught me off guard, and I felt a surge of panic, my mind racing as I struggled to come up with an answer. "Of course, Mom. Everything's fine." She didn't seem convinced, her gaze lingering on my face for a moment longer before she turned back to her food. But I could feel the weight of her suspicion, the unspoken questions that lingered in her eyes, and I knew that our secret was teetering on the edge of discovery. As I sat there, my heart pounding, I glanced at Alex, his gaze filled with the same fear that mirrored my own. We both knew that we couldn't keep this up, that eventually the truth would come to light, but neither of us seemed capable of walking away. The weight of our secret was suffocating, a constant reminder of the line we'd crossed, and the consequences we would soon have to face. And as I looked at him, the sadness and longing in his eyes a mirror of my own, I knew that our story was far from over, that the unraveling of our secret had only just begun. The tension in the house had reached a breaking point. My mom's glances were no longer casual or subtle, and I felt her suspicion pressing down on me like a weight. Every moment spent in her presence was fraught with fear that she'd see through my attempts to act normal, fear that she'd discover the truth I was so desperate to keep hidden. One evening, as we were all sitting in the living room, the silence felt unbearable, heavy with unspoken words and lingering tension. I could feel her eyes on me, the intensity of her gaze making my skin prickle, and I knew she was waiting for me to slip, to reveal something that would confirm the suspicions she hadn't dared to voice. I was painfully aware of Alex sitting across from me, his gaze fixed on the floor, his posture tense and rigid. Then, suddenly, my mom broke the silence. "Jessica, I need to talk to you," she said, her voice calm but filled with a gravity that made my stomach drop. I froze, my heart pounding as I met her gaze, the severity in her eyes making it clear that this wasn't a simple request. She turned to Alex, her expression unreadable. "Alex, would you mind giving us a moment?" He glanced at me, his expression conflicted, but he nodded, rising from his seat and leaving the room without a word. The sound of his footsteps faded down the hallway, and I felt a cold dread settle over me as my mom looked at me, her gaze unwavering, piercing. "Mom, what's this about?" I asked, forcing a lightness into my tone that I didn't feel. She studied me for a moment, her silence stretching out until it felt unbearable. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but filled with a tension that sent a shiver down my spine. "Jessica, is there something you want to tell me?" The question caught me off guard, and I felt a surge of panic, my mind racing as I tried to come up with a response. I forced a laugh, shaking my head. "Mom, I don't know what you're talking about." She didn't smile. Her gaze was steady, her expression filled with a mixture of concern and sadness that left me feeling exposed, vulnerable. "I'm your mother, Jessica," she said softly. "I know when something's wrong. I've seen how you've been acting, how you and Alex avoid each other, yet seem drawn together." The words were like a punch to the gut, and I felt my heart race, a cold fear settling over me as I realized just how close she was to the truth. I opened my mouth to protest, to deny everything, but the look in her eyes made the words catch in my throat. "Mom, it's nothing. You're just overthinking things," I managed, my voice trembling. She sighed, her expression softening as she reached out, taking my hand in hers. "Jessica, I'm not blind. I've seen the way you look at him, the way he looks at you. I don't know what's going on, but I'm worried. I'm worried that you're getting caught up in something that's only going to hurt you." Her words hit me like a cold wave, and I felt a surge of guilt, the weight of our secret pressing down on me with crushing force. I wanted to tell her the truth, to confess everything, but the fear of her reaction held me back. The fear of what would happen if she knew the extent of the line we'd crossed. "Mom, I promise it's nothing," I said, forcing myself to meet her gaze, hoping she couldn't see the lie in my eyes. "Alex and I were just adjusting to this new family dynamic. That's all." She looked at me, her gaze filled with a mixture of disappointment and sadness, and I felt a pang of guilt that left me feeling hollow. I knew she didn't believe me, that my words had done little to ease her suspicions, but she seemed to accept them, nodding slowly. "If there's something you need to tell me, Jessica, I'm here for you," she said quietly. "You don't have to go through this alone." The sincerity in her words made my throat tighten, and I felt a surge of emotion that left me feeling raw, exposed. I wanted to tell her everything, to unburden myself of the secret that had been tearing me apart, but I couldn't. The fear of her reaction, of the damage it would do to our family, was too great. "Thank you, Mom," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "But there's nothing to tell." She gave me a long, searching look, her eyes filled with a sadness that made my heart ache. "All right, Jessica, but please be careful. Whatever it is you're hiding, I just want you to be safe." I nodded, my heart heavy as I watched her leave the room, her footsteps fading down the hallway. The guilt was suffocating, a constant reminder of the line I'd crossed, and the consequences I was now facing. I knew that my mom's suspicions were only growing, that it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. After that conversation, things became even more tense. My mom's watchful gaze seemed to follow me everywhere, and I felt trapped under the weight of her silent questions, the concern that lingered in her eyes whenever she looked at me. It was as if she was waiting for me to slip, to reveal the truth she was so close to discovering. I tried to avoid her, to limit our interactions, but it was impossible to escape her scrutiny completely. Every dinner, every family gathering was a test of my resolve, a reminder of the web of lies I'd spun around myself. I could see the suspicion in her gaze, the unspoken questions she was too afraid to voice, and it left me feeling hollow, as if I were living a double life, a stranger in my own home. And it wasn't just my mom. The strain of our secret was taking its toll on Alex, too. He was distant, quieter than usual, his gaze averted whenever we were in the same room. I could see the guilt in his eyes, the way he avoided our parents, the way he seemed constantly on edge, as if he were waiting for the inevitable moment when everything would come crashing down. One evening, as I was sitting alone in the kitchen, lost in thought, he walked in, his expression tense. He didn't say anything at first, just leaned against the counter, his gaze fixed on the floor. And I felt a surge of sadness, a deep ache that left me feeling hollow. "Jessica," he began, his voice barely more than a whisper. "We can't keep doing this. It's destroying us." I looked at him, my heart heavy as I took in the strain etched on his face, the sadness in his eyes. I knew he was right that our secret was tearing us apart, that the weight of it was too much to bear. But the thought of letting go, of walking away from him, felt like a loss too painful to endure. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I don't know how to fix this." He sighed, running a hand through his hair, his expression conflicted. Maybe we need to come clean. Maybe we need to tell them the truth." The suggestion sent a jolt of fear through me, and I felt my heart race, my mind reeling at the thought of exposing our secret. The consequences were unimaginable, a nightmare I couldn't bring myself to face. "No," I said quickly, shaking my head. We can't do that. It would destroy everything." He looked at me, his gaze filled with sadness, and I could see the conflict in his eyes, the same mixture of fear and guilt that had been haunting me. We both knew that our secret was unsustainable, that the weight of it was tearing us apart, but the fear of discovery, of the damage it would do to our family, was too great. "Then what do we do?" he whispered, his voice filled with despair. I didn't have an answer. The silence between us was thick, heavy with the weight of our unspoken fears, and I felt a surge of helplessness, a deep, aching sadness that left me feeling hollow. "We'll figure it out," I said finally, my voice barely audible. "We have to." But even as I said the words, I knew that our story was reaching its breaking point, that the walls we'd built around ourselves were beginning to crumble. And as I looked into his eyes, the sadness and longing a mirror of my own, I knew that the unraveling of our secret was inevitable, that the consequences we'd tried so hard to avoid were waiting just around the corner, ready to shatter the fragile world we'd created. The tension that had been simmering between Alex and me finally reached its breaking point. We'd been trying so hard to keep our secret buried, to pretend that everything was normal, but the strain was becoming unbearable. Every interaction with our parents felt like a minefield, every shared glance between Alex and me loaded with guilt, fear, and an unspoken understanding that we couldn't keep living like this. One night, after another tense family dinner, I found myself unable to sleep, my mind racing with all the what-ifs and the possible consequences of our actions. I tossed and turned, the weight of our secret pressing down on me like a physical burden, suffocating and inescapable. Around midnight, I heard a soft knock on my door. I sat up, my heart pounding as I stared at the door, knowing exactly who it was. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, letting him think I was asleep, but the pull was too strong, and I found myself slipping out of bed and crossing the room to open the door. Alex stood there, his expression tense and conflicted, his eyes filled with the same turmoil I felt. We didn't speak, words felt unnecessary at that moment. Instead, he stepped into the room, closing the door quietly behind him, and I felt the weight of our secret settle over us like a heavy blanket. "I can't do this anymore, Jessica," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. This isn't right. It's tearing us apart." I looked at him, feeling my heart ache with a mixture of sadness and longing. I knew he was right. The guilt, the constant fear of discovery, it was eating away at us, leaving us both feeling hollow and broken. But the thought of walking away, of letting go of the connection we shared, felt like a loss I couldn't bear. "I know," I whispered, my voice trembling, "but I don't know how to let go." He sighed, running a hand through his hair, his expression filled with frustration and pain. Maybe we don't have a choice. Maybe the only way to fix this is to end it, to go back to the way things were before." The words hit me like a cold wave, and I felt a surge of panic at the thought of losing him, of letting go of the connection we'd fought so hard to keep hidden. I wanted to protest, to tell him that we could find a way to make this work, but deep down, I knew he was right. The weight of our secret was too much to bear, and we were both drowning under the strain. "I don't want to lose you," I murmured, my voice barely audible. He looked at me, his gaze softening, and I could see the sadness in his eyes, the same aching sorrow that mirrored my own. "You're not losing me, Jessica, but we can't keep living like this. It's not fair to anyone." The honesty in his words left me feeling exposed, vulnerable, and I felt a pang of sadness as I realized the depth of his conviction. We'd been clinging to each other, trying to hold on to something that was never meant to last, and now we were paying the price. Maybe you're right," I whispered, the words painful to say. He reached out, his hand gently cupping my cheek, and I felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of longing and sorrow that left me feeling raw. "I'll always care about you, Jessica, but we need to let this go. We need to let each other go." The finality of his words left me feeling hollow, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek as I nodded, knowing that this was the only way forward. We were standing on the edge of a precipice, and the only way to save ourselves was to walk away, to leave behind the connection we'd fought so hard to keep hidden. We stood there in silence, the weight of our decision settling over us like a shroud, and for a brief, stolen moment, I allowed myself to savor the warmth of his touch, the steady beat of his heart, the familiarity of his presence. It was a goodbye, a silent farewell to the secret we'd shared, and I felt a pang of loss that left me feeling hollow. After what felt like an eternity, he let go, stepping back and putting a distance between us that felt both painful and necessary. I wrapped my arms around myself, feeling the weight of our decision settle over me, the realization that we were letting go of something that had defined us, something that had been both a source of comfort and pain. "Goodbye, Alex," I whispered, my voice barely more than a breath. He nodded, his gaze filled with sadness, and for a moment, I thought he was going to say something, to offer some final words of comfort. But instead, he turned and walked out of the room, closing the door quietly behind him, leaving me alone with the silence and the weight of our goodbye. The next morning, the house was quiet, the atmosphere heavy with an unspoken tension that hung in the air like a storm cloud. I went through the motions, pretending that everything was normal, but the emptiness inside me was inescapable, a constant reminder of the decision we'd made, the connection we'd left behind. At breakfast, my mom noticed the change in my demeanor, her concerned gaze lingering on me. As I pushed my food around my plate, my appetite lost. She didn't say anything, but I could feel her worry, her silent questions hanging in the air, and I felt a pang of guilt, a reminder of the secret I'd been hiding, the deception I'd woven around myself. Alex was quiet too, his gaze averted, his expression tense and unreadable. We avoided each other, our unspoken agreement to let go creating a distance between us that felt both painful and necessary. It was as if we were strangers, two people pretending not to know each other, pretending that the connection we'd shared had never existed. After breakfast, I retreated to my room, unable to face the weight of our decision, the reality of the choice we'd made. The silence was suffocating, a constant reminder of the emptiness that had settled over me, and I felt a surge of sadness, a deep, aching sorrow that left me feeling hollow. I wanted to cry, to release the weight of my emotions, but the tears wouldn't come. I was numb, caught in a state of limbo, torn between the guilt of what we'd done and the pain of letting go. It felt as if a part of me had been ripped away, leaving behind an emptiness that I didn't know how to fill. As the day wore on, I tried to distract myself, to focus on anything other than the loss that had settled over me like a shadow. But no matter how hard I tried, my mind kept drifting back to him, to the memory of his touch, the warmth of his presence, the connection we'd shared. It was a wound that refused to heal, a constant reminder of the line we'd crossed and the price we were now paying. And yet, despite the pain, a part of me knew that this was the only way forward. We couldn't keep living in the shadows, hiding behind a secret that had been tearing us apart. Letting go was the only way to find peace, to rebuild the lives we'd nearly destroyed. But as the sun set and the house grew quiet once more, I couldn't shake the feeling that a part of me would always be haunted by the memory of what we'd shared, that the ache of our goodbye would linger, a ghost of the secret we'd left behind. I went to bed that night feeling a strange mixture of relief and sorrow, a quiet acceptance of the choice we'd made. I knew that we'd done the right thing, that walking away was the only way to heal. But the emptiness remained, a reminder of the connection we'd left behind, the bond that had been both our comfort and our undoing. And as I lay there in the darkness, listening to the quiet of the house, I realized that this was our ending, a silent farewell to the secret we'd shared, a final goodbye to the forbidden connection that had defined us. It was painful, and it left me feeling hollow, but I knew that it was necessary, that this was the only way to find peace. The memory of him lingered, a bittersweet reminder of the love we'd hidden, the bond we'd shared. It was a chapter of my life that I would carry with me, a reminder of the choices I'd made, the lines I'd crossed, and the price I'd paid. But as I drifted off to sleep, I felt a sense of closure, a quiet acceptance of the path we'd chosen. And though the ache of our goodbye would linger, a part of me knew that this was the only way to move forward, to find a new beginning in the ashes of our secret. The days that followed felt strange, hollow, as though a vital part of my life had been stripped away. Alex and I barely spoke, moving around each other in the house as if we were strangers, keeping a careful distance that only served to deepen the ache of our separation. Each time our paths crossed, I felt a flicker of longing, a reminder of the connection we'd shared, but I forced myself to look away, to hold on to the decision we'd made. For our parents, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. They were blissfully unaware of the emotional turmoil that had reshaped our world, the quiet sadness that lingered beneath our interactions. My mother would occasionally ask if I was okay, her voice laced with concern, but I brushed it off, assuring her that everything was fine, that I was simply busy with school and other responsibilities. The guilt of lying to her again gnawed at me, but I knew that revealing the truth would only bring pain to everyone involved. One evening, a few weeks after Alex and I had ended things, my mom sat me down, her expression filled with an earnestness that caught me off guard. She took my hand, her eyes soft as she studied my face, and I felt a pang of fear that somehow, despite everything, she could see through the facade I'd so carefully maintained. "Jessica," she began softly, "I've noticed you've been distant lately. Is everything all right?" The question was simple, but it struck a nerve, and I felt my composure waver as I forced myself to meet her gaze. The truth lay heavy on my tongue, a secret I wanted so desperately to confess. But I knew that doing so would only hurt her, that exposing what Alex and I had shared would shatter the family we'd worked so hard to build. "I'm okay, Mom," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "Just a lot on my mind." She nodded, her expression understanding, but I could see the concern in her eyes, the worry that she was too afraid to voice. "If you ever need to talk, sweetheart, I'm here for you. I just want you to be happy." The sincerity in her words left me feeling exposed, vulnerable, and I felt a pang of sadness as I realized how deeply my actions had affected not only myself and Alex, but also the people we loved. I knew that I had to let go of the past, to move forward and find a way to rebuild my life, but the ache of our goodbye lingered, a constant reminder of the bond we'd shared. "Thank you, Mom," I whispered, forcing a smile. "I appreciate that." As the days turned into weeks, I began to focus on finding a sense of normalcy. I threw myself into my schoolwork, spending late nights at the library and weekends studying with friends, hoping that the distractions would dull the ache of our separation. Slowly, I began to feel a sense of clarity, a quiet understanding that the path we'd chosen, painful as it was, had been necessary. But every now and then, I would catch a glimpse of Alex across the room, his face shadowed by a sadness that mirrored my own, and I felt the familiar pang of longing, a reminder of the connection we'd buried, the love we'd hidden. It was a quiet, haunting presence, a ghost of the secret we'd left behind, and I knew that no matter how much time passed, a part of me would always carry the memory of what we'd shared. One evening, I found myself sitting alone in the backyard, the quiet of the night soothing and peaceful. The stars above seemed impossibly distant, their light faint and cold, and I felt a strange sense of detachment, a feeling that I was somehow suspended between the past and the future, caught in the lingering echoes of our goodbye. As I sat there, lost in thought, I heard footsteps behind me, and I turned to see Alex standing a few feet away, his expression hesitant, his gaze filled with the same sadness that had haunted me for weeks. "Hey," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hey," I replied, feeling my heart race at the sight of him. He took a step closer, his gaze searching my face, and I felt a flicker of the connection we'd shared, the bond that had once bound us together. But it was different now, softened by time and distance, a quiet understanding that, despite everything, we would always care for each other. "I just wanted to see how you were doing," he said, his voice filled with a quiet sincerity. "I know things have been hard." I nodded, feeling a surge of emotion that left me breathless. "Yeah, they have. But I'm doing okay. I think I'm finally starting to move forward." He smiled, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "I'm glad to hear that. You deserve to be happy." The sincerity in his words left me feeling exposed, vulnerable, and I felt a pang of sadness as I realized that this was truly goodbye. We'd shared something that defied logic, something that had brought us both comfort and pain, but it was time to let go, to leave the past behind, and find a new path forward. "Thank you, Alex," I whispered, my voice filled with a quiet sincerity. "For everything." He nodded, his gaze softening, and for a moment, we simply looked at each other, the silence between us filled with a quiet understanding. A final farewell to the connection we'd once shared. It was painful, bittersweet, but I knew that this was the closure we both needed, the chance to move forward with a sense of peace. As he turned to leave, I felt a sense of calm settle over me, a quiet acceptance of the path we'd chosen, the decision we'd made to protect ourselves and the people we loved. It wasn't easy, and a part of me would always carry the memory of what we'd shared, but I knew that this was the only way to find healing, to let go of the past and embrace the future. The weeks turned into months, and slowly, life began to take on a sense of normalcy. I focused on my goals, on building a life that was my own. And though the memory of our secret lingered, it became a part of my past, a chapter that I could look back on with a sense of clarity and understanding. And in time, I found that the ache of our goodbye had softened, replaced by a quiet gratitude for the lessons I'd learned, the growth I'd experienced. It wasn't the ending I'd imagined, but it was the one I needed, a path forward that allowed me to find peace, to let go of the secrets and lies that had once held me captive. In the end, I realized that love, even the forbidden kind, had shaped me, had taught me the importance of honesty, of courage, of letting go. And though the memory of what we'd shared would always be a part of me, I knew that I was ready to move forward, to find a new beginning, a fresh start that was free from the shadows of the past. And as I walked into the future, leaving the echoes of our secret behind, I felt a sense of freedom, a quiet hope that, one day, I would find the happiness I'd been searching for, a happiness that was all my own.